You ever notice how our families have these stories that we tell over and over again? And every family has a different story, but it's become kind of famous within your family. Maybe it's something crazy that has happened, something funny that has happened, but it's a story that gets retold over and over again. I know in my family, it's a really crazy story about something that happened to my mother when she was a teenager. You see, her family grew up extremely poor in Knoxville, and she was staying with my aunt, who is her sister, who was about 10 years older than her. And the house that they lived in was a very kind of poor house in a rough neighborhood next to a junkyard or a garbage dump or something like that. Well, my mother, who was a young teenager, was staying over at their house in the guest room and she was asleep. And what had ended up happening was a giant rat had found its way into her room and it climbed up in bed with her and it started chewing on her jawbone. And the crazy thing about the story is that it must have chewed through a nerve because she didn't feel it biting her. And she only woke up because she started feeling blood drip down the rest of her. And it's super traumatic and scary, but it gets a little funny towards the end because she runs into my aunt's room and they turn on the lights and she's standing there with blood drenched all over her. And, my aunt starts freaking out. And my mother was fine. She's fine to this day. But that story's so crazy that it's just one that gets told in my family all of the time. And I would bet that your family has a crazy story that gets told all of the time. And stories, they stick with us. Whether they're funny or sad or traumatic or just out of this world insane, they stick with us. Humans love stories. And you know what? Jesus told stories. He told them all the time. He knew that stories would stick with us. He called them parables, and a parable really is just a story that has a spiritual point or a lesson behind it. But Jesus would use these parable stories to kind of teach people things about who he was, who God was, and he used them all throughout the Bible. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at a story. In this lesson, the storyteller is a lot about how Jesus was this man who told stories so that people could learn about God and the kingdom of heaven and about Jesus. And the story we're going to look at today was recorded by a guy named Luke. He was one of Jesus's disciples, and he actually has his own book in the Bible. It's called the Book of Luke. It's a gospel. You can find it in the beginning of your New Testament. And he wants to start the story by giving us some context as to who it is he is talking to, who Jesus is talking to when he's telling these stories. So Luke chapter 15, verse 1 says that tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. And the thing here is that in the culture that they were living in, it was really obvious to tell who the sinners were. If you could tell who a sinner was based on the kind of job that they have, or based on the way that they dressed, or based on just their reputation within the community. And it was also very obvious who the religious people were. You could tell who the religious good people were based on what they wore, and based on their jobs, and based on their reputation in the community. And the religious people, they didn't really love the idea of Jesus associating with such a rough crowd, of talking to the tax collectors and sinners. In fact, 15 verse 2 says, "This made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he was associating with sinful people. He was even eating with them," they go on to say. And that was a big deal for them because to eat with someone was to go to someone's house and to sit down at a table and to do almost like an intimate thing, sharing a meal together. And the religious people didn't like that. And I mean, I kind of get it. Because if we're being honest, for those of us who are church people and who have gone to church for a while, sometimes we can't help but look down on people who don't have it all together. Sometimes we look at people who have questionable reputations and we've seen some of the actions that they've made, or we've overheard some of the ways that they speak and the words that they use. And because of some of those choices, we just wonder what's going on there. And sometimes we look at them a little different than we do at the people who look like us, or talk like us, or act like us. And on the flip side of that, there are people, even in our church, who maybe are on the other side. Maybe this faith thing is new to them. Maybe being in the youth group is new to them. They weren't raised in the church. They got invited and they've been here for a little while now, but they might still see themselves as the person on the other side. And maybe you don't exactly feel welcomed by the religious crowd. Maybe it seems like the religious people are a club that you're not a part of. Well, either way that you feel, all of us feel like in order to be with God, we have to behave a certain way. That God kind of dictates whether we are deserving of His love based on how we act. But this story that I'm going to read to you today and that we're going to talk about kind of flips that on its head. And it kind of talks about how God views people on both sides of that coin. You see, Jesus tells this headline story, this really big story about a man and his two sons. And I'm going to read it to you. It happens in Luke chapter 15. It's verses 11 through 32. It's a really big story. I'm not going to put it up on the screen because it would take up the whole screen to put all this stuff on there. But what I invite you guys to do is listen to the story as I read it. Maybe go back and read it later for yourselves. Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. But the first thing that happens here happens in the beginning of verses 11 and 12. Jesus says this. To illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. A man had two sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. You see, basically, the younger son is going to his father and saying, Dad, I know that when you die, whenever that is, 20, 30 years from now, you're going to leave me some stuff. But instead of waiting for that to happen, I want you to just go ahead and give me that stuff now. Right? Can you imagine doing this with your parents, walking up to them and going, hey, Mom, Dad, listen, I know that when you die, I'm going to get like the house or you're going to leave me a car. Like, let's just forget about, just give that stuff to me now. Just give it to me now. And the crazy thing is that for some reason, his father agreed to this. It says the father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. And so the story goes on, chapter 15, verses 13, it says, a few days later, this younger son packed all of his belongings and moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all of his money in wild living. You see, the son makes a bunch of poor decisions with his cash that can leave him with nothing to show for it. And then it gets even worse. 14 through 15 says, about this time the money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his field to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding to the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. You see, the son went from being rich after getting all this money from his father to so broke that he was willing to eat the scraps that were left over for the pigs to eat. He went from having all of this money and living this wild, crazy party lifestyle to so broke that he's living in a field with pigs and eating the same food that they're eating. But the story doesn't end there. You see, the boy decides that he's going to go back home. And verses 17 on say this. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home even the hired servants have enough food to spare, and here I'm dying of hunger. I will go home to my father, and I will say, Father, I've sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, Father, I've sinned against both heaven and you. I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. But his father said to the servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. Kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast, for the son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found, and the party began. The son expected to be treated like a servant, but the dad wasn't interested in that. He had his son come back to him. And now is a good time to remember the two groups of people who were listening to this story when Jesus was telling it. For the sinners in the crowd, the message was unlike anything they had ever heard before. They had never heard a story where someone could do something bad and be fully forgiven even after the fact. But also for the religious leaders, this didn't sound so great to them, because what they were thinking in their head was, if this person can be forgiven after doing all those bad things, then what about me? I've not done any bad things. I'm supposed to be the better person. I'm supposed to be the one that is worth more. But Jesus wasn't done with the story. You see, Jesus had something that he needed to say to the religious people as well. And so he brings in the older brother. Remember at the beginning of the story, it said that there were two sons. The younger one who went away and wasted all of his money. And it just kind of mentioned that there was another son. But what was this older son doing all of this? And so Jesus has this part of the story that he starts to bring up. And so Luke 15, verses 28 through 32 said, the older brother was angry, and he wouldn't go into the party. His father came out and begged him to come in, but he replied, all of these years I have slaved for you, I have worked for you, and never once refused to do a single thing that you have told me to do. And in all that time you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back after squandering all of your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf. And then his father said to him, look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything that I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found. You see, Jesus is looking at the audience, the sinners and the religious leaders, the good people and the bad people, the ones who make mistakes and the ones who haven't. And he knows that they both agree that the younger son should have to pay for his behavior, that he should be punished for the way that he acted, that he shouldn't be treated so nicely, and that the older son should be the one who was rewarded for his good behavior. But instead, they got something totally different from Jesus. And this is the point. This is what Jesus was trying to prove with this story. You see, in this parable, the great storyteller Jesus was making a point that people who were unsure if they were qualified to follow him because of their mistakes, you don't have to be fixed in order to be found. Jesus was telling people, the incredible thing about this story is that the message is, you don't have to have everything perfect in order to follow Jesus. You don't have to have it all right. You don't have to believe that because you've made a mistake, there's no hope for you. Jesus is telling this story because Jesus is pretty much saying, I and God look at you like a son. When you're gone from us and you're gone away doing these mistakes and these bad things, we miss you. But when you come back, we welcome you with open arms. Even after the things that you've done poorly, we still want to be with you if you'll return to us. And the incredible thing about the story and the message that it gives is that it still matters today. You see, for people who think they've gone too far, for people who think they've messed up too much, done too many bad things, Jesus is saying, I will never give up on you. And for the people who are making the good decisions and doing the right things, Jesus is saying, don't ever give up on someone else. That people are always worth the investment. And so, the question I'm going to leave you guys with today, and the challenge I'm going to issue for you is this. Who are you in the story? Who are you in this story? Are you the good kids? Are you the religious people who are listening to the story? Are you the older brother? The one who has been doing this faith thing for a while now. You grew up in the church and you've always felt like you've had a good handle on this, and sure, you've made some mistakes along the way, but not any big ones, and you've never felt like God was far away from you. If that's you, then I want you to ask yourself a question. If Jesus doesn't think that they need to be fixed in order to be found, do you? Do you think that there are people out there who you maybe have shied away from, people that you've not told the story of Jesus to simply because you thought they were too far gone and that it wouldn't matter anyway? And if you are, and that can be tough to say, yeah, maybe I am one of those people, my challenge to you would be think of one or two friends, or maybe even not friends, but people that you know of who seem really lost, who seem like they don't know the story of Jesus and they are making poor decisions and maybe their life isn't the best looking from the outside. Maybe start praying for them. Maybe ask them to hang out in a safe place, somewhere like your house or in a public place, somewhere where they can't manipulate the conversation, somewhere where you feel comfortable and they feel comfortable, a common ground. And maybe you just start telling them some stories. Maybe you tell them some stories of some things that you've done wrong and how God still loved you, or maybe some really happy and awesome stories of some of your favorite moments from church or your favorite moments from the youth. And maybe you just start inviting them to hang out, to learn more about this Jesus and this God. On the flip side, other of you who may be watching this video, you might feel like the younger son. You might feel like you've disqualified yourself from the church and from Jesus' love. Maybe you've made mistakes. Maybe you're afraid that the things that you have done or maybe you are continuing to do have made you someone who can no longer be fixed. If that is you, I just need you to know, I need you to remember that Jesus always has open arms for someone like you. And maybe you need to read this story again. Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. Luke 15, 11 through 32. Read this story. Remind yourself that even after this son went away and did all of these terrible things, made all of these mistakes, did things that hurt himself and hurt others, that he was still welcomed when he chose to come back. You may have lost your way, but you haven't lost your value. God still sees you as one of his children. He still sees you as something precious. Jesus is ready for you to take a step in his direction. And for all of us, I think we need to remember that you don't have to be fixed in order to be found. That God is in the position of taking broken people and making them into rock stars. He does it all throughout his word in the Bible. He does it today in life. That's just who he is. And so, as we continue on this series and as we keep talking about things, I want you to just remember that stories are impactful and that Jesus is using this story to remind us that we always have a place with him. Regardless of which situation we find ourselves in, all we have to do is turn to him and he will welcome us with open arms. I'll see you guys next week.